In the early days of emotion research, one of the things the researchers struggled with was the question of how many emotions there actually are. And there was a debate about whether there were just a few basic emotions and others were just a variation of those basic emotions, or were there in fact dozens and dozens of very discrete, separate, and completely different emotions. Some researchers are still interested in this question, but we now have a somewhat different way of thinking about emotion. Instead of thinking about emotions as separate, discrete, and numerous, we think of each emotion as simply where we stand on a couple of basic dimensions. Your textbook describes something called the circumplex model of emotion, which says that all emotions can essentially be described according to where they fall on two different dimensions. How aroused are you, and how much pleasure are you experiencing? In the diagram that you see on this slide, the horizontal line that goes from left to right goes from negative to positive. The word valence means essentially pleasure. More positive emotions are to the right, more negative emotions are to the left. And arousal levels range from very low to very high. And if you look at the words in the circle, you'll notice that certain emotions are positive and highly aroused, like excited and delighted. Others are negative, but low in arousal, like bored and depressed and tired. And so what you really are doing is thinking about where you stand on these two different dimensions, rather than thinking about specifically which emotion you're experiencing. The model on this slide is not in your textbook. It's called the three-factor theory of emotion, but it's created by some of the very same people who are responsible for the circumplex model. And the three-factor model describes your emotional state according to three dimensions instead of two. How aroused you are, how much pleasure you're experiencing, but also how dominant or submissive you feel. Do you feel like you're in charge, in control, or do you feel sort of at the mercy of someone else or forces beyond your control, or feel sort of intimidated? Every emotion that we experience, according to this model, can be described where you are on these three dimensions. So, for example, if I were to suddenly ask you in one of my classes to stand up and make an oral presentation, and you have to do it with only 15 minutes preparation, and it's going to count for a big part of your grade, I would expect your arousal levels to be near the arousal end of this line. Your pleasure levels would be way down in the non-pleasure dimension, and you would probably be much more at the submissiveness than the dominance end. So high arousal, low pleasure, low dominance. If I were to ask you to come up with a name for this emotion, you might say anxiety, fear. You might come up with some other name, but notice if you just changed one thing. Let's suppose arousal levels are high. Dominance is still low, so you're way down by the submissive end. But now pleasure is high. What kind of emotion would you be experiencing there? It certainly wouldn't be anxiety or terror. Think about being on a roller coaster, for example, if you like roller coasters. Arousal levels are high. You don't feel in control. You feel kind of at the mercy of what's going on. But your pleasure levels are high. So just by changing where you are on one dimension, you completely change the nature of the emotion that you're experiencing. This slide illustrates some of the pairs of words that are used on the questionnaire to measure where you are on each of those three dimensions that we're talking about. So for the pleasure dimension, you're choosing where you fall between contented and melancholic, between hopeful and despairing, between relaxed and bored. In the arousal dimension, we're talking about frenzied versus sluggish, excited versus calm, wide awake versus sleepy, jittery versus dull. And under dominance, there are things like dominant and submissive, in control versus cared for, autonomous versus guided. So one of the more popular ways of thinking about emotion now is to think of it in terms of a combination of a few basic dimensions, These theories that I just described are only a couple of examples of many different models that are out there. And researchers don't talk so much anymore about discrete, separate emotional states.